The book of Revelation uses all kinds of Old Testament allusions, types, shadows, patterns, and you have to understand quite a bit about the Old Testament in order to understand what is actually going on in the book of Revelation. And remember, Revelation is the premier foundational book that tells us about the end times and what's going to happen and who it's going to happen to. When I very first started trying to understand this most marvelous book of Revelation, I became aware that Revelation is actually a temple story. It's the story of God's heavenly temple and how he brings groups of people into his presence. And everybody who shows up in the heavenly temple is a Christian. They're all believers. You can't get into the heavenly temple unless you're a Christian. That's the only way. Everybody else is going to have to wait until after the millennium in order to be able to be in God's presence or to see him at all. We're the only ones who actually have an entrance into the heavenly temple. So when God told Moses and described to him how he wanted the tabernacle to be built, the tabernacle in the wilderness that we read about in the book of Exodus, God said, be sure and make it exactly like the pattern that I showed you on the mountain. So Hebrews tells us that Moses constructed the tabernacle according to the heavenly pattern. And as I was going along in my temple studies, I understood that there's actually three major kinds of temples that we see in the Bible. The tabernacle of Moses, the tabernacle of David, which kind of doesn't get talked about at all, and the temple of Solomon. And these reflect the three different dispensations in the history of redemption. So the tabernacle of Moses is a picture of Christ at his first coming. There's nothing glorious on the outside. It's just animal skins that people see. There's nothing wonderful there. But once you get inside of that tabernacle of Moses, you see the gold and the presence of God is there. And there's all kinds of wonderful and marvelous things happening inside. This is a picture of Christ at his first coming, including him being the fulfillment of all the sacrifices in the Old Testament. And then we have the tabernacle of David, which is when the tabernacle of Moses got divided into two parts. The Israelites were at war with the Philistines, and the Israelites said, hey, let's bring the ark into battle with us. That way we'll win. But God was done with whatever was going on there at the tabernacle and all the foolishness of Eli and his sons who were, not very morally upright people. And so God says, I'm done here. And he leaves. Okay. And this is the occasion on which the presence of God actually leaves the tabernacle of Moses. His ark is also a chariot. It's his throne, and it's sort of his litter of how he moves from place to place. He ends up in Jerusalem with King David, who is a type of Christ and a type of the priesthood of Melchizedek, where you are a king and a priest. So David was a king, and he would also sit in God's presence as a priest. According to Acts 15, the tabernacle of David is a type of the present church age. Ever since the apostles, this is sort of the temple dispensation we've been living in. And I would just refer you to my Temples of God video series. There's so much types, patterns, symbols in all of those temples that it's really amazing, wonderful, and just great. So I refer you to those videos. So when I first started looking into this, I realized what we're looking at here is a temple story. We're looking at priests coming into God's presence, priests after the order of Melchizedek, who are people who are kings and priests. I want to point out a few of these things before we talk about the groups of Christians who are going to be brought into heaven at different times, according to their rotation and according to the position that they have in the heavenly temple. I like what Ken Potter says, that most people think that heaven and hell are kind of communists. In other words, everybody does the same thing. Everyone gets kind of the same position in heaven, and everybody's sort of treated exactly the same. And that nothing could be further from the truth. We are not. We're all treated according to our faithfulness, according to our determination to enter into the presence of God, according to the things that we love. And there are people who will have closer access to the throne of God than others. It's about position and proximity. What is the position you will have in the heavenly temple, and what is your proximity to God? So I just want to look at kind of the parts of a temple, and you can go back into both Exodus and then I think also in Kings, and you can read about the parts of a temple. And this is just very simplified. The temple was a two-part building or tent, depending on whether it was Solomon's temple or the Tabernacle of Moses. The Ark of God was over in this part right here, and this is where the presence of God was. This was considered his throne. Then there was this veil, which we learned from Hebrews that this represents actually Christ's body. It says that we enter into God's presence through the veil of Christ's body. On the other side of that veil is the altar of incense. The opening, the doorway to the temple is on the east. That's why I have it set up like this. God's presence comes from the east, exits to the east when he leaves Solomon's temple. In Revelation, we know that there are 7 torches before the throne of God. Okay, this is the throne of God, the ark. Priests minister out in this part here, but this is the sacred space right there, this little part where God's presence is. Remember on the veil here, there were cherubim who were embroidered on them, and I think those also represent the 4 living creatures. So we've got some layers of symbolism here. The table of showbread was right here. The 7 torches, like I said, that sort of represents the menorah. Okay, on the outside of the tent or the temple was the sea of glass, and this is a laver. It was made out of the mirrors of the women of Israel, and I'm talking about the Tabernacle of Moses here. And on an earthly temple, there would be the altar of burnt offering right here. All right, this is the basic structure, and then all around it was an enclosure, and again, just one door right here. And this basically separated out this whole deal from where the people were, okay? So the people couldn't just, barge on in. This was all considered kind of a sacred space. So when we look at people that we see in heaven, like the 24 elders, the 144,000, the 5th seal martyrs, the martyrs of the beast, the group of people in Revelation 15 that we see standing on the sea of glass or beside the sea of glass right after they've been raptured, just before the bowls of wrath are poured out. Okay, these are all separate groups. They're all Christians. Okay, you can't get to heaven and be in God's presence apart from the blood of Christ. There is no way that there is anybody up there in heaven unless they're saved, redeemed, unless they're Christians. When Christ died, this veil was torn in two, and so there was access made for people to come into God's presence. The 4 living creatures, we assume, are still there, but what we see among the 4 living creatures are the 24 elders, and they're all around this throne. They're all worshiping God. They're seated on thrones. They have golden crowns on their head. They're wearing white robes. They are holding bowls of incense. They're holding harps. Every one of these symbols tells us something about who these people are. They're worshipers. That's what the harps are all about. The white robe lets us know they're priests, as does the incense bowls they're holding, where they're offering up incense. The golden crowns let us know that they're kings, they're going to rule with Christ, and the fact that they're seated on thrones also lets us know that they're going to act as judges too. So you remember in the book of Exodus, when God was getting ready to lead the children of Israel out, he told Moses to tell Pharaoh that Israel is my firstborn, and I want to have him go into the wilderness so he can worship me. Israel is my firstborn. That means Israel is going to have the double portion inheritance. God chose Israel from among all the nations of the earth to be his special and treasured possession. And then in Exodus chapter 19, God spells this out a little further, and he says, I want you to be the agency of blessing throughout the world. Okay, so a lot of people take Exodus chapter 19 and they turn it into some kind of betrothal thing. That is not what's happening here at all. God is taking Israel as his firstborn, and he is offering them the double portion of being kings and priests. Now, this should sound a little familiar because in Revelation chapter 1, we've been called and we've been made into a kingdom of priests, kings and priests for God. That's believers through the blood of Christ. So when we look at the 24 elders, what we see are what Israel had been originally called to be, which is the firstborn, the people who have the double portion inheritance, who are kings and priests. They're after the order of Melchizedek. It's a priestly group of kings. They're also considered firstborn. They get that double portion blessing and the birthright. So when Israel rejected their Messiah, this part of being kings and priests came to believers. It's transferred to us. The whole bride thing, well, that'll happen later. But right now, we've been called to be sons to God. According to Hebrews, Christ died to bring many sons to glory. So the idea here is not that a bride is being brought into heaven to be glorified, or that the church as one just group of people is all brought in at one time, but the idea of sons being brought into their positions in the heavenly temple. So the 24 elders are going to be around the throne. That's you and me, those of us who are persevering in our walk of faith with the Lord. And we'll be joined by apostles and even people from the Old Testament who were people of faith. The book of Hebrews, chapter 11, talks about people of faith, including Moses, and it says about him that he was willing to suffer basically the loss of all of Egypt's goodies for the sake of Christ. That's even the words that are used. For the sake of the Messiah, he was willing to suffer. Another group of people who will also be kings and priests, that is, they're going to rule and reign with Christ, are the overcoming 144,000 of Israel. The ones who overcome are going to be present in heaven as kings and priests. Firstborn, okay? Remember, the firstborn are redeemed from the earth. And also the last group of people who have this position of kings and priests in God's very presence around his ark, around the throne, are the martyrs of the beast. Okay, so these are the groups that will have that, will be kings and priests. They're considered firstborn. And remember, only the high priest could enter into this part, and only once a year, and he would bring the blood of the Day of Atonement sacrifices as well as incense, this cloud of incense. Okay, so this is the position of the high priest. Okay, Christ is our great high priest, and we are priests as well. We get to sit on thrones with Christ in God's presence. So this is an honor that we've been bestowed, or that will be bestowed on us as part of our inheritance for overcoming. In the Old Testament temple, There were other priests beside the high priest, okay? And these other priests were welcome to come into this portion of the temple. Remember, it was divided in two, and this was called the Holy of Holies, and this was the holy place. And you could be just a regular priest and come into this portion of the temple and make sure that there was oil for the lamps and do the incense and partake of the showbread. And this is where the priests ministered. This is where the fifth seal martyrs are going to minister. Right here. Revelation chapter 7 talks about this great crowd who are going to be in the temple of God. And notice they're standing. They're wearing the white priestly garments. Priests do not sit while they're ministering. Okay, they do not sit. They only stand. There is no chair here for them. So they are going to be priests to God during the millennium. This is the fifth seal martyrs. Outside over here, this is where the Levites were. Okay, the Levites helped with, doing the sacrifices and so on and so forth. The Levites were over here. And there were actually other people too who were sort of enslaved to draw water and be the hewers of wood. And they were contributors to whatever was going on this side. But there is actually a group of people, at least one group that we know of people who go to heaven and are in this portion of heaven. And that is those who are alive and remain, the survivors of the reign of the beast. Okay, and this is the group that's standing by the sea of glass in Revelation chapter 15. Okay, they're standing by the sea of glass. That would be pictorially represented by that laver. So this is kind of the place of where the Levites are. Okay, these are people who survive, and they're going to be taken into heaven alive before Christ sets up his millennial reign. Now, we know that this group right here, these people who are kings and priests, they're going to rule with Christ on earth. And this is during the millennium. Okay, the fifth seal martyrs, they're going to stay in heaven. They're not leaving the heavenly temple. And I think the same thing is true of those who are the survivors of the reign of the beast. And I think anybody who didn't qualify as firstborn, the woman's other offspring, these are people who will be resurrected at the seventh trumpet. And that's the last trumpet, okay? And they will probably be here as well. If they are not a king, they're not going to rule and reign with Christ on earth. So they will remain in the heavenly temple. Now, I know there are people who are Christians who have apostatized. There's a lot of people in centuries past that, they were born again. They did believe in Jesus. They did trust in him for their salvation. But if you don't continue on in faith, you don't get the inheritance. The picture of this is the children of Israel. They had the blood applied to them. They were baptized in the cloud and in the sea, and they went to start to walk their spiritual walk on the way to their inheritance. But because of unbelief, because of grumbling and complaining and not believing that God was important or that God was powerful enough to be able to take them all the way to their inheritance, they didn't get an inheritance. They didn't get an inheritance. It's not that they weren't saved. They were saved. They were saved from Pharaoh. They were saved from Egypt. And in this case, people are saved from the wrath of God, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they will have a position in the heavenly temple. Now, heaven is bigger than just the place where God's presence is. There are fallen angels who live outside the heavenly temple, and they're eventually going to be cast to the earth. Okay, that'll be just prior to the abomination of desolation. And it's what's happening outside here, okay, outside of the heavenly temple. And it's very possible, very likely that people who are apostate, the people we read about in Jude and in 2 Peter, people who are basically, it's people who are teachers, people who are false prophets, people who lead people into immorality and into, really bad beliefs, okay? Having wrong doctrine here and there about different things like eschatology is not a core issue or fundamental issue of Christianity, like the deity of Christ and, his blood atonement and stuff like that. That's stuff that you have to hold on to. You can have all kinds of other interpretations about all kinds of other things. We don't know the full story, only know in part. That's not a problem. The problem is when we lead people astray so that it affects their eternal salvation, their eternal position in God's kingdom. Okay. People who are apostate, these are people who will end up in outer darkness. And for me, my thinking is it's likely that they're going to go to heaven. They will be brought to heaven, and they will not rule on the earth during the millennium, and they will be out here somewhere. Okay, they're going to be outside where the people were, okay? During the time of Moses, the Israelites were out here. They didn't have a position in here, but they were delivered from Egypt. They were blood bought, just like everybody else was. And we know that there was a lot of rebellion and things that went on among the people outside of the tabernacle. There was a bunch of things that happened with the people. Outside of this area in heaven, I'm not sure all is well. Okay, and I think this is part of the reason why God is going to create a new heaven as well as a new earth at the end of the millennium. We've been called to something that's really awesome, really great. We've been called to be a kingdom of priests to God, to have a high position, just right, next to Christ. We're seated with him on his throne. Okay, this is a very high and exalted and glorified position. We're close to God. We're as close as you can get. We're within his 4 cherubim bodyguards. I mean, we are considered safe people. We are his council. We're part of that divine council. We rule with Christ. We will rule with him on earth. The 5th seal martyrs will gain the second closest position, but it's because they give up their lives. They lay down their lives. They will go into the New Jerusalem. They will be part of the bride when the bride comes down with the holy city at the end of the millennium. And so this is good news for them, but it's sort of bad news as to how they get there. It's not going to be pretty. And then there are a group of people who minister outside. They are associated with the sea of glass, with a further out proximity. These people right here, the 5th seal martyrs, they're wearing the white priestly garments. They have white robes on. These people here who are the survivors of the reign of the beast, they are not wearing white robes. We don't see them with crowns, thrones, white robes, nothing. We see them standing. They're standing on the sea of glass or by the sea of glass or at the sea of glass. And they have harps in their hands. And this is something, it tells us that these people are worshipers. These people who survive the reign of the beast are also worshipers. They will be in the proximity of the heavenly temple. They're not going to be outside of it somewhere. They will be there. And I think other people who are resurrected and rewarded and so on will have a position right here. Okay, with these people who are in God's temple, but are not going to rule and reign. The only ones who are resurrected at the 7th trumpet, who are going to rule, are the martyrs of the beast. Everybody else will get some other kind of reward, but they are not going to be on earth during the millennium. All right, and then I think that the apostates are going to be out here. They will be in heaven. They're not going to rule and reign on the earth. They've been promised immortality. They're born again, okay? They've got the Spirit of God inside of them. So they are going to become immortal, but they are going to be outside of that heavenly temple, just like they're going to be outside of the holy city, the New Jerusalem. So our position, according to faithfulness, not according to being really good. I'm not talking about being really good and doing all the right things. I'm talking about faithfulness to what you have been given, however small it is. Be faithful in the little, I'll put you over much. And our willingness to persevere, like just not give up on Jesus. Okay, even if you keep falling and you keep sinning and you get back up again and you repent and you keep moving forward, good for you. Good for you. Persevere. That is what God is looking for. People who love him enough to persevere and who trust that he has them. Okay, God has you. Right? So our perseverance and faithfulness determines position. We've all been promised this position right here, but whether or not we get it depends on whether we persevere in our faith. The fifth seal martyrs, they will be brought to heaven and be in God's presence in the heavenly temple for the duration of the millennium. The survivors of the reign of the beast will be raptured just prior to the bowl judgments on the beast and the beast kingdom and anybody who sides with the beast. And after Christ's return, anybody who's resurrected at that time will either be a part of this group here, the Levites, or if they're apostate, they'll be over here outside of God's courtroom in heaven. And if they are people who are beheaded by the beast, then they will be among those who rule and reign with Christ on the earth during the millennium. They also have access to the heavenly temple. So they get to come and go, just like all the rest of us who are kings and priests. This is God's plan for us. This is what he wants for us. But like the children of Israel who went into the wilderness, a lot depends on your attitude toward God. So when God brought them into the wilderness, part of it was to test them. And testing has to do with seeing what you're made of and what you think about God or what you believe about God when you're in the middle of trouble. So when the spies came back, the 12 spies came back, and 10 of them had an evil report, and Joshua and Caleb said, no, we can do this. God is with us. We can do this. Their attitude about God's faithfulness to them determined their faithfulness toward God. And it's what they believed about God that was so important. Joshua and Caleb believed God. They believed that God was able to help them conquer the land, whether there were giants there or not. They saw all the things God did in Egypt, and they believed God could do this for them. The other 10 spies, they saw the land, they saw that it was good, but they didn't believe that God was going to enable them to conquer the land. And so they got what they thought. They would not get anything, okay? They had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for every day that the spies spied out the land. There's another example. The people were in the wilderness, and all of a sudden there wasn't any water. And so they started grumbling and complaining, rather than saying to themselves, you know, God's led us out this far. You know, I bet he has a plan for giving us water. He's shown us that he loves us and that he wants to deliver us. He's not going to let us die here in the wilderness. That's the attitude of faithfulness that God was looking for, and that would have brought tremendous blessing to the children of Israel. As it was, God was not pleased with them. He gave them water anyway, but he made note of that grumbling and complaining spirit that they had. It's a spirit of unbelief, that God does not care, he doesn't love, that God allows bad things into our life because he wants to make us miserable, when just the opposite is true. God allows tests to come into our life so that we can learn to trust him, and so that we can see where our heart is with him. Do we believe that God is going to take us all the way to our inheritance, or do we believe that God has just abandoned us and now we're on our own? Okay, it's what we believe about God that is so important. So there's a parable of the talents, and I love this parable because it sort of gives us another example of what this looks like. There was a man who was leaving to go on a journey. He had some resources that he wanted to have invested, and so he gave 10 talents to one man. He gave 5 to another, and to another one he gave 1. And he said, I want you to trade with this until I get back, and then we'll see how you did. So the first 2 servants, one of them had more capability, so he was given more money to invest. He had 10, and he went ahead and he traded and he did stuff, and he threw his heart into it, and he believed that the master knew what he was doing when he entrusted him with 10 talents. And when the master came back, he said, here's your 10, and I got you 10 more. And the same thing happened with the servant with the 5 talents. But when it comes down to the guy that he only gave 1 talent to invest, the man said, I knew you were a hard master, that you reap where you didn't sow. And so, I knew you were a hard guy. And I just said, you know what? I don't want to lose this because he'll be mean to me. And so I just buried it, and here, take what is yours. Well, the master said, you're condemned out of your own mouth. Okay, you think I'm a hard man? Well, I guess you're going to find out what hard looks like. And he told his servants to cast him, this wicked servant, into outer darkness. Okay, this is a place of unbelief. This is the place where people who have low views of God end up. The master had this servant. He was a believer, okay? And yet he was going to be cast into outer darkness because his attitude toward his master was just terrible. And it was so not true. It was so not true. What the master wanted to do was to actually allow these people to have the opportunity to get more. So in one version of these parables, master says, take that 1 talent that belonged to that one guy and give it to the guy who has 10. And they said, well, he's already got 10. Then we read that to him who has will more be given, and he will have it in abundance. But he who has not, even what he has will be taken from him. Or in some versions say, even what he thinks he has will be taken away from him. The guy with the 10 talents gets to rule over 10 cities. 10 cities. He's going to enter into the joy of his master and be a co-ruler with him. So we're talking about attitude here. God can read your heart, and if what he saw inside your heart was, God, I think you're a mean God. I think you do things that are wrong, and I think you're a bad God, and I don't really want to worship you. I have to tolerate you, but I don't really like you. I mean, this is where we say, look, here I am. I'm in a bad spot, but God is here with me, and he has a plan for the test. And the test is so that I can actually be proven, have this proven character so that God can give me more, so that I am qualified or competent to handle more. And these are all lessons that we learn here on this side. The reason God took the children of Israel into the wilderness was because he had to take a nation of slaves and turn them into conquering kings. And that's the same thing that God is doing with you and me. We were slaves to sin, slaves to Satan, and he has to take us from a place of slavery through times of testing and trial and so on, so that we are qualified to be kings and co-inheritors with Christ. And anybody who isn't willing to make that journey is going to fall in the wilderness. And yes, you're saved. Okay, yes, you can't go back to Egypt. You'll never go back to Egypt. You can't recross the Red Sea. You can't redo or undo the Passover. All that's behind you. But you can go through all the parts of salvation and still not get your inheritance through unbelief. Okay, and unbelief is an attitude that we have toward God, that he's not good. So this is something that, if you got that problem, you want to get that taken care of right now. And just say, God, no matter what I go through, no matter what comes toward me in my life, I know you're with me. I know you got my back. And I know that this is only for my good and for your glory. And I pray that you will give me the power to come out on the other side. All right, so if you have a comment, leave it in the comment section. Don't have any show notes for this video. I just thought it was important to get it out. But I hope you were blessed, and I hope you were encouraged. And we'll see you real soon on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.